The year was 1890, and the name Appalachia Outlaws was whispered with a mix of fear and admiration across the western states. Led by the charismatic but ruthless Silas Croft, the gang was a force to be reckoned with. Their last heist was a masterstroke of timing and brutality, robbing the Blackwood stagecoach of its gold payroll, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. There were 5 men, each with a distinct and dangerous skill set. Silas, the cunning leader; Jed, the quiet, deadly sharpshooter; Finn, the brawling muscle; and the brothers, Eli and Abe, who handled explosives and knew the land like the back of their hands. They vanished into the unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, a place few dared to tread. Lawmen, desperate to capture the gang and recover the gold, scoured the dense forests, but the mountains seemed to swallow them whole. The manhunt was a disaster. The local sheriff's posse returned empty-handed and rattled, telling tales of the forest playing tricks on their minds. "The mountains got 'em, Sheriff," one man muttered, his eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with bullets. They just disappeared. For days the posse searched. They found the gang's last known campsite, untouched, with a fire still smoldering. A half-eaten meal sat on a tin plate. A deck of cards lay fanned out on a log. It was as if the men had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. It was too strange, too unsettling. The sheriff, a man who had seen his share of violence and mystery, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. The camp wasn't abandoned. It felt vacated. The only lead was a trail of fresh bootprints, leading away from the campsite, deep into the woods. The prints were clear and distinct, 5 sets of them, and they marched with a steady purpose. The posse followed them for miles, through thick underbrush and over moss-covered rocks. The prints were a testament to the men's single-minded flight, a clear sign that they were still on the move, still alive. The trail led them to a small, isolated clearing, where an old, crumbling chapel stood silent and imposing. It was a relic of a forgotten time, its windows boarded up, and its wooden frame weathered to a sickly gray. The posse approached with caution, their hands on their holsters. The chapel's bell tower was a hollow skeleton against the sky, and a single, heavy oak door was slightly ajar. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and decay, and a strange, profound silence had fallen over the clearing. It was a silence that made the skin crawl. As they got closer, they saw it. The trail of bootprints ended at the foot of the chapel's stone steps. The 5 sets of prints simply stopped. There were no marks of a struggle, no sign of retreat, no new prints leading away from the chapel. It was as if the outlaws had walked up to the door and simply ceased to exist. The sheriff pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, a layer of dust covered everything. Benches were overturned, and a few tattered hymn books lay scattered on the floor. A single, overturned candlestick was on the altar, its wax long since hardened. The space was empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, piercing through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of a fight. Nothing. For years, the chapel stood as a monument to an unsolved mystery. The Appalachia Outlaws had been swallowed by the mountains, and the chapel became the last known location of a group of men who simply walked into a dead end and vanished from the face of the earth. The legend of their disappearance grew with time, and the chapel became a place whispered about with dread. The gold was never recovered. The men were never seen again. Their bootprints remained, an eerie, inexplicable full stop to a life of crime and a chilling footnote in the annals of frontier history. The mystery of the chapel would remain untouched for decades, a cold case that would eventually be passed down to the next generation. A truth that would remain buried until a curious and determined mind, driven by a thirst for facts and an unwavering skepticism, would arrive in the small town, ready to pull at the threads of a narrative that was far more sinister than a simple disappearance. The legend of the Appalachia Outlaws was a ghost story with no ghost, a crime with no resolution, a chilling tale of men who walked into a chapel and simply evaporated. But what if they never left? Don't miss the next chapter of this chilling story. Subscribe to our channel to uncover the secrets of the Appalachia Outlaws' disappearance. Decades later, the legend of the Appalachia Outlaws had faded into a regional ghost story, a campfire tale for tourists passing through the small, forgotten towns of the Appalachian Mountains. But for Dr. Elias Thorne, a cynical and brilliant historian, it was a cold case waiting to be solved. He arrived in the town of Blackwood, a place seemingly frozen in time, its streets lined with weathered wooden buildings and its air thick with the scent of pine and generations of unspoken secrets. Unlike the romanticized accounts of local folk tales, Elias was here for the facts, not for the fables. He was a man who believed in the tangible, the provable, and the logical. The idea of 5 men simply vanishing was an affront to his sensibilities. Elias drove his modern, dust-covered automobile through the winding, narrow roads, the engine a noisy intruder in the quiet landscape. He had come armed with dusty maps, old census records, and a healthy dose of professional skepticism. His first stop was the Blackwood Historical Society, which was little more than a small, musty room above the general store, run by a gaunt and suspicious woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, with her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, seemed to view Elias and his questions as an unwelcome intrusion. "The outlaws? Folks don't talk about that much anymore," she said, her voice dry as dead leaves. "It's old history. Best left alone." "History is never best left alone," Elias countered, his tone professional yet firm. "I've read the reports, the bootprints ending at the chapel. It's an impossible detail. Something was left out of the official record." Eleanor simply shrugged, her face a mask of indifference. "Maybe they got tired of running and just walked on, right into heaven." Her words were laced with a sarcasm that was not entirely convincing. Elias spent the next few days immersing himself in the town's archives, a collection of brittle newspapers, handwritten church logs, and personal diaries from the late 19th century. He noticed a peculiar pattern. The town of Blackwood was founded by a small, tight-knit religious community. Their founding principles were centered around self-sufficiency and a strict, isolationist doctrine. The Old Town records painted a picture of a community that was deeply suspicious of outsiders and fiercely protective of their way of life. They seemed to view the outside world, with its laws and its progress, as a source of corruption. Elias found a mention of the preacher from the old chapel, a man known only as the Shepherd. The few mentions of him were cryptic, almost reverent. A diary entry from a local farmer spoke of the shepherd's unique methods for guiding lost sheep back to the flock. Another entry described a local man who had turned to drinking and gambling, suddenly ceasing his bad habits after a session with the shepherd. There was no mention of the outlaws by name, but the timing of these entries coincided with the period of their disappearance. The more Elias dug, the more he felt an unspoken tension in the air. The locals, old men who sat on their porches whittling wood, would fall silent as he approached. The young people, disconnected from the past, simply seemed indifferent, treating him as a strange tourist. The town was a living organism, and Elias could feel its collective resistance to his presence. He wasn't just an outsider. He was an investigator of their carefully guarded secrets. One evening, while poring over a faded map of the area, Elias found an anomaly. A small, unmarked trail, not on any modern map, was sketched lightly in pencil, leading from the general direction of the outlaws' last known campsite directly to the chapel. It was a trail known only to a few, a secret path that could have led the outlaws straight to their final destination. The map was tucked inside a church logbook, a detail that seemed insignificant at first, but now felt like a breadcrumb. Elias decided to visit the chapel. The path was overgrown and difficult to find, but his instincts, honed over years of historical fieldwork, led him to it. The trail was barely visible, a ghost of a path through the dense forest. He walked for nearly an hour, the silence of the woods broken only by the crunch of his boots on dead leaves. The air grew colder, and a fog began to roll in, obscuring the trees around him. It was then that he saw it, a distant skeletal silhouette against the grey sky. The old chapel. It was just as the reports described, weathered and foreboding. As he approached, Elias felt a strange, anachronistic sense of dread. This wasn't the fear of a place being haunted. It was the chilling feeling of being watched, of walking into a space that held a very human, very terrible secret. He was no longer just a historian, he was a detective, and he had just stepped onto a crime scene that had been dormant for a century. The ground at the foot of the chapel steps was covered in new grass and moss, but Elias could almost see the phantom bootprints, a testament to a final walk towards an unknown fate. He didn't believe in ghosts, but in that moment he felt the presence of the past, a heavy, silent weight of 5 men who walked here and were never seen again. He was beginning to understand that the mystery wasn't about what supernatural force took them, but what very human force had sealed their fate. The town's cold reception, the cryptic references, and the hidden path all pointed to a community that wasn't just hiding a secret, but actively preserving it. Elias knew he had to keep digging, no matter how much the living history of Blackwood resisted. The truth of the Appalachia Outlaws' disappearance lay not in the legends, but in the dark, twisted heart of the town itself. Elias's visit to the chapel cemented his conviction that the outlaws' disappearance was no act of nature or supernatural event. He returned to Blackwood, his focus sharpened, his skepticism now a tool for cutting through the town's silent resistance. He spent the next several days at the Blackwood Public Library, an institution as small and unassuming as the Historical Society, run by a kindly but cautious librarian named Mary. Unlike Eleanor, Mary was more willing to help, but her words were carefully chosen. The town was founded by a group of devout pioneers, she explained, her voice soft. They believed the world was corrupting, and that true salvation could only be found through hard work and purity of spirit. The old chapel was a place of reflection. Elias sensed the hesitation in her voice. Reflection? What kind of reflection? Mary hesitated, her eyes darting away. They believed in a kind of penitence, that a man could only find redemption by confronting his own sins. The shepherd was the one who guided them. People used to come to him from all over the region, seeking his guidance. This confirmed Elias's suspicions. The shepherd was not just a preacher. He was a manipulator, a psychological architect. Elias began to dig deeper into the library's archives, sifting through old town council meeting minutes and personal correspondence from the 1880s and 1890s. He found a series of letters written by a man named Thomas Abernathy, a local who had been a contemporary of the outlaws. The letters were addressed to a cousin in another state, and they were filled with a growing sense of unease. The shepherd's influence grows stronger by the day, one letter read. He speaks of unburdening the soul and stripping away the worldly self. There is a fervor in his sermons that chills me to the bone. Men who were once proud and boisterous now walk with their heads bowed. It is not faith I see in their eyes, but a terrible kind of peace. Another letter, written a few months later, spoke of the outlaws' arrival. The sheriff's men passed through but did not venture into the woods. The town is silent on the matter. I have heard whispers from the younger boys that the outlaws were not a simple band of criminals, but a test sent by Providence. The shepherd is watching. We are all watching. Elias felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The town wasn't simply isolated, it was a collective. They were all in on it. They didn't fear the outlaws, they saw them as an opportunity. He cross-referenced the names in the letters with the local census records and found that many of the families from that time still lived in the area. Eleanor Vance, the woman at the Historical Society, was a descendant of one of the founding families. Her hostility now made perfect sense. She was protecting a legacy, a dark secret that had been passed down through generations. He returned to the Historical Society, this time with a specific purpose. He didn't ask about the outlaws. Instead, he asked about the founding families and their customs. He spoke of the town's unique heritage, using the same flowery language he had read in the old texts. Eleanor's resistance began to crumble, replaced by a strange kind of pride. She showed him a small, locked display case containing a few personal artifacts from the town's earliest days. Inside, behind the glass, was a worn leather journal. "This belonged to Jedediah Abernathy," she said. Her voice hushed. He was one of the town's first, a righteous man. Elias's heart pounded. Jedediah Abernathy was Thomas's older brother, a man who had not written the letters of concern, but had remained in Blackwood. He was likely a follower of the shepherd. Elias asked to read the journal, and Eleanor, seemingly pleased by his interest in her family's history, relented, handing him a key. He was careful to show no excitement as he unlocked the case and gingerly lifted the journal. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulous, spidery handwriting. Elias flipped through them, his eyes scanning for any mention of the outlaws. He found nothing explicit at first. The journal was filled with religious musings, biblical passages, and accounts of daily life. But then, tucked between two pages, a single, folded piece of paper fluttered out. Elias unfolded it, his hands trembling slightly. It was a crude map of the area surrounding the chapel, with the 5 outlaws' names scrawled at the top, followed by a list of their known sins: Silas, pride, greed, Jed, violence, cruelty, Finn, wrath, gluttony, Eli, deceit, cowardice, Abe, envy, theft. Beneath the names was a new list, a list of tests. Test 1, isolation. Test 2, trust. Test 3, guilt. Test 4, paranoia. Test 5, humiliation. There were check marks next to each one. Elias felt a cold dread wash over him. This wasn't a crime. It was a ritual. The town hadn't captured and killed the outlaws. They had systematically broken them, exploiting their weaknesses and their past crimes. The chapel wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a stage. A psychological prison designed to shatter the minds of 5 hardened criminals. He had been looking for a murder, but he had found something far more macabre. He had found a slow, deliberate form of psychological torture, designed to cleanse a soul by utterly destroying it. The journal entry from Jedediah Abernathy was a chilling confirmation of Elias's darkest theories. The list of tests proved that the outlaws had not simply been cornered, but had been deliberately and meticulously tormented. Elias carefully copied the notes, his hands steady despite the surge of adrenaline. He couldn't risk taking the journal. The moment he left the Historical Society, he was a marked man. He felt the weight of the town's gaze on him, the unspoken question of what he knew now. He had crossed a line, moving from harmless researcher to a threat. He returned to the chapel, this time with a new understanding. The silence of the forest, the overgrown path, they weren't just features of the landscape, they were parts of the trap. The outlaws, on the run and exhausted, would have seen the chapel as a sanctuary, a place to hide and regroup. But it was a lure, a spider's web woven by the town. Elias began to re-examine the outlaws' personalities, a task he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Now, with the list of sins and tests, it was the key. He looked at old wanted posters and newspaper articles, piecing together a profile of each man. Silas Croft, the leader, arrogant, intelligent, and driven by a fierce sense of self-preservation. His sin was pride. The test of isolation was likely designed to break his command over the group. Jed, the sharpshooter, quiet, loyal to Silas, and a man who valued trust above all else. His sin was violence. The test of trust would have exploited his one vulnerability, his reliance on his gang. Finn, The brawler. Impulsive, driven by a quick temper and a love for food and drink. His sins were wrath and gluttony. The test of guilt would have targeted his raw, primal emotions, making him regret his every violent act. Eli and Abe, the brothers, inseparable, relying on each other for survival. Eli, a master of deception, and Abe, a skilled thief. Their sins were deceit and envy. The test of paranoia would have turned their unbreakable bond into a source of suspicion and fear. The final test, humiliation, would have been the endgame, the final act of breaking their will. Elias's research now took on a new, more sinister dimension. He went back to the old Abernathy letters, searching for a more personal account of what happened. He found a final, brief note, written in a shaky hand. "They are gone. The work is done. The shepherd has proven his way. The outlaws are no more. They are at peace. But it is a peace I do not wish for myself. I will never speak of this again." Thomas Abernathy had clearly been a dissenter, a man who had seen the psychological cruelty of the town's justice and been horrified by it. He had left Blackwood shortly after the outlaws' disappearance, his letters ceasing entirely. The more Elias learned, the more he felt the weight of the town's gaze on him. He felt the cold reception. The silence and the dismissive stares were not just a quirk of small-town life. They were a threat. He was a trespasser on a sacred, terrible ground. He was disrupting a century of silence, a century of secrets. One afternoon, as he was leaving the library, an old man who had been sitting on a bench whittling a small bird from a piece of wood spoke to him. The man, with a face as weathered as the chapel itself, hadn't looked up from his work. "Some things are meant to stay buried, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The outlaws were not good men. The town simply helped them find their way." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. The man wasn't a threat in the physical sense, but his words were a clear, chilling warning. They were not just a product of a religious isolationist community. They were a part of a collective psyche, a shared, terrifying belief that what they had done was a form of justice. Elias knew he had to act fast. He had found the journal, he had found the old letters, but he still didn't have the final piece of the puzzle. What happened inside the chapel? What was the peace that Thomas Abernathy had spoken of? And where were the outlaws' bodies? He needed to find the outlaws' own account of the events. He had been looking for external evidence, but the most important evidence would be their own words, their own descent into madness. He returned to the Historical Society, this time looking for any personal belongings of the outlaws that might have been found and held in storage. Eleanor Vance was not there. The door was locked. He was too late. He had tipped his hand, and now the town was closing ranks. He had to get to the chapel. He had to find what he was looking for before the town could make it disappear forever. He knew they were watching him, but he also knew that their true fear wasn't of a stranger, but of the truth he was about to uncover. He had found a story of human depravity, a psychological horror that was far more terrifying than any ghost story. Elias, now on a desperate clock, knew he had to find the outlaws' perspective. He had to find their version of the story before the town could erase it. The Historical Society was locked, and the town was now a network of eyes watching his every move. He decided to search for a source that no one would think to look for. The outlaws' own words. He went back to the local library, poring over old newspaper articles from neighboring towns. He was looking for any detail, no matter how small, that had been missed by the official reports. He found it in a small, faded article from a newspaper in a town 20 miles away. It was a brief piece written a few weeks after the outlaws' disappearance, detailing the fruitless manhunt. But a single line caught his eye. Sheriff's posse found a satchel belonging to the outlaw Finn near the abandoned camp, but no personal effects of consequence were mentioned. This was a detail the Blackwood papers had omitted. Elias knew that if the satchel was found, it must have been taken to the sheriff's office in town. The old office was now a crumbling, disused building on the outskirts of Blackwood. He drove to the building, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. The lock on the front door was rusted and fell away with a gentle tug. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and dust. Old desks and filing cabinets were scattered about, their contents long since removed. Elias scoured the place, his heart thumping in his chest. He was searching for any sign of that satchel, any forgotten piece of evidence. He found nothing. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a loose floorboard near what must have been the old sheriff's desk. He knelt down and pried it open with his pocket knife. Inside, tucked away in the dusty crawl space, was a small, canvas-wrapped object. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a worn, leather journal, its cover stamped with the initials S.C. Silas Croft. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had found it, the outlaw's own account, the last testament of a desperate man. He took the journal back to his car, his hands trembling as he opened it. The first few pages were a chronicle of their escape, a proud and arrogant account of a successful heist. Silas wrote of their plans to lie low, to wait for the manhunt to die down. But then, the tone shifted. The mountains are a curse. We thought we knew them, but they play tricks on the mind. The trees close in, the air grows heavy. We can't shake the feeling that we are being watched. Jed swears he saw a face in the fog. Finn's temper is shortening. We came across an old chapel. It looks like a good place to hide. The lock is busted, the door ajar. It's a sign. Providence is with us. Elias felt a chill. The outlaws had walked right into the trap, believing it was their sanctuary. The journal entries grew more frantic. The first night, we heard a woman weeping, a sorrowful, lonely sound that echoed from the woods. We searched, but found nothing. Finn is losing his mind, screaming at the trees. He thinks they're mocking him. We don't know what's real anymore. They are turning us against each other. Last night, Jed saw me steal a small portion of our food. He says I'm trying to hoard it, but I swear I did no such thing. He looks at me with a suspicion I've never seen before. We are falling apart. Abe and Eli argue constantly. They think one of them is trying to poison the other. They are becoming strangers to one another. They are speaking to us, whispering our sins. Jed hears a voice that sounds like the man he killed in the holdup. Finn is tormented by the screams of the people he hurt. Abe and Eli are hearing their own voices, accusing each other of betrayal. It is a psychological torment. They are not ghosts. They are memories given sound. We are being driven mad. Silas's journal detailed the systematic breakdown of the gang. The town wasn't using supernatural means, they were using psychological warfare. They were exploiting the outlaws' guilt and paranoia, using their knowledge of the men's pasts against them. The weeping woman was likely a local in the woods, trained to mimic a sorrowful cry. The accusations of theft and betrayal were likely the result of carefully placed objects and subtle manipulations. The town was a theater, and the outlaws were the actors in their own demise. Elias had found the truth. It wasn't about a vanishing act. It was about a slow, deliberate form of torture that had driven 5 men to madness. Silas's final journal entries were a testament to this descent. We are trapped. We ran right into a cage. The chapel is not a sanctuary, it's a tomb. We are no longer outlaws. We are broken men, stripped of everything we ever were. The town is watching. They want us to break, and we are breaking. There is no escape. The only path left is the one we forge ourselves. The journal ended abruptly. There was no final entry, no last-minute escape. The outlaws had been driven to their breaking point, their minds shattered, their camaraderie destroyed. Elias held the journal in his hands, a chilling testament to the power of human depravity. The peace Thomas Abernathy had spoken of wasn't a peaceful death. It was a release from the torment of their own broken minds. Elias knew where to go next. The journal had mentioned the chapel was the cage. The final scene of this psychological horror show had played out there. He had to return, and he had to find the final piece of this grim puzzle. The outlaws were not gone. They had been driven to their end, but their bodies, their final resting place, had to be somewhere in or around the chapel. Elias returned to the chapel under the cover of a thick, persistent fog that seemed to swallow the landscape. The old building stood as a silent sentinel to a past crime, its presence more ominous now that he knew its true purpose. Armed with Silas's journal, he knew the outlaws had been driven mad within these walls, and he was determined to find their final resting place. The journal had mentioned a tomb, a final act of despair. He began his search inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom and the swirling dust. The interior was exactly as the old reports had described, empty and desolate. Elias checked every nook and cranny, tapping on walls for hollow spots, looking for any sign of a hidden passage or a buried secret. He ran his hand along the stone foundation, feeling for any dislodged bricks or unnatural seams. Nothing. The chapel itself seemed to offer no clues. He'd been so focused on the building, he hadn't considered the possibility that the final act had been performed elsewhere. The outlaws, stripped of their sanity and their will to live, might have taken their own lives in a place they believed was a final act of defiance against their tormentors. Elias stepped outside, his mind racing. The journal mentioned a path they forged themselves. This wasn't a physical path, but a psychological one, a path to the end. He began to search the perimeter of the chapel, his flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. The land was uneven, covered in thick moss and fallen leaves. He found nothing, only the silence of the woods. He looked at the chapel again, its bell tower a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. The bell itself was gone, but the rusted framework remained. He had read somewhere in the old texts that the bell had been a part of the town's founding, a symbol of their faith. But now, it was a hollow symbol, a silent witness. Elias sat on the stone steps, a profound sense of despair washing over him. He had come so close. He had the outlaw's own words, the town's chilling confession, but he was missing the final piece, the physical evidence, the proof of what the town had done. He felt the cold eyes of the past watching him, a cruel kind of victory in their silence. Then, he remembered a detail from Silas's journal that he had initially dismissed as a feverish delusion. The walls are not what they seem. There is a false peace in this place, a hollow victory in their sound. The bell is gone, but the sound remains. The sound, the weeping woman, the mocking voices. They weren't coming from the woods, they were coming from within the chapel. How? Elias stood up, his mind now working on a different track. He went back inside, his focus now on the acoustics of the building. The walls were thick stone, but the ceiling was high, and the space created a powerful echo. He clapped his hands, and the sound reverberated, a loud, clear slap against the silence. But it was not a true echo. It was a distorted, mocking sound. He clapped again, and this time he heard a faint, high-pitched ringing, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It sounded like a small, distant bell. He looked up at the bell tower. The rope was still there, but it was frayed and broken. He followed the line of the rope with his eyes, from the tower down to the floor, where it disappeared into a small crack in the stone. He knelt down, and with a surge of adrenaline he pulled on the rope. It was old, but it held firm. He pulled with all his might, and slowly, a small circular stone panel in the floor began to shift. He pulled harder, and the panel slid to the side, revealing a narrow, dark opening. A set of rusted iron rungs led down into the blackness. Elias felt a surge of triumph mixed with a heavy sense of dread. He had found it, the hidden passage. He had been looking for a tomb, but he had found a cellar. He had found the false peace Silas had written about. This was where the outlaws had been held captive, a soundproof chamber where their minds had been systematically destroyed. He descended the rungs, his flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The air was cold and still, smelling of damp earth and decay. The chamber below was not large, and the stone walls were smooth and seamless. But what lay in the center of the room made Elias's blood run cold. There were 5 stone slabs, arranged in a circle. On each slab sat a rusted metal chair. On each chair sat a small, leather-bound book, their pages curled and brittle with age. And in the center of the circle, a small brass bell hung from a chain, its surface polished and gleaming. It was the source of the ringing sound, a bell that, when struck, created a perfect, clear note that would reverberate in the enclosed space, a constant, maddening sound that would drive a man to the brink of insanity. But that wasn't what truly horrified Elias. It was the books. They were journals, written in 5 different hands. He picked one up, his hands shaking. It was Finn's journal. The last entry was a single scrawled word: peace. Elias understood now. The outlaws had not simply died. They had been driven to such a state of despair and mental collapse that they had been purified of their sins. They had been given a choice: to live forever in this psychological prison, or to end the torment. The town hadn't killed them. They had pushed them to kill themselves, a final, horrifying act of self-purification. The town had not only destroyed 5 men, but they had convinced them to do the final work themselves. This was the peace Thomas Abernathy had spoken of, a peace that was far more sinister than death. Elias had found the evidence. He had found the truth. But now he had to face the most chilling realization of all. He was alone in a town that had kept this secret for a century, and he had just uncovered it. He knew they were watching. He had found their gruesome secret, and they would not let him leave with it. He was now a part of the story, and the town would ensure his silence. Elias knelt in the subterranean chamber, his mind reeling from the discovery. The 5 journals were a chilling testament to the psychological torment the outlaws had endured. He picked up Jed's journal, its pages filled with frantic, spidery handwriting. Jed, the sharpshooter who valued trust, wrote of his growing suspicion of his comrades. He described finding small, misplaced objects, a favorite bullet casing in Silas's pocket, a piece of his own chewing tobacco in Abe's hand. These were not coincidences. They were meticulously planned manipulations designed to sow distrust and paranoia. His final entry was a single, defiant line: "They can break my mind, but they cannot break my spirit." Eli and Abe's journals were a heartbreaking chronicle of a bond being systematically severed. They wrote of hearing their own voices from the shadows, accusing the other of betrayal. The town had used their deep connection against them, creating an echo chamber of self-destruction. Their final entries were not words, but a series of crossed-out names, each name a person they no longer trusted, until only their own remained. They had turned on each other and then, finally, on themselves. Finn's journal was a descent into a primal, animalistic state. He wrote of constant, high-pitched ringing and the smell of rot that no one else could detect. He described hearing the screams of a man he had killed, a constant chorus of his past sins. The town had used their knowledge of his violent past to create a personal hell. His final entry, the single word peace, was a chilling testament to his surrender, a broken man giving in to the torment. And Silas, the leader, the man of pride. His journal was the most devastating. He wrote of the tests, recognizing them as a game, and for a while he believed he could outsmart his unseen tormentors. He wrote of trying to rally his men, to convince them it was all a ruse. But as each man broke, Silas's entries became more desperate, his arrogance replaced by a quiet, soul-crushing despair. The final entry was a confession, not of a crime, but of a man who had lost everything, including himself. The game is over. I lost. The greatest outlaw in the West reduced to this. They took everything. My pride, my men, my will. There is nothing left. Only a choice. Elias understood now. The outlaws had been given a final choice: to live forever in a state of psychological torment or to find a release. The town had not only killed them, they had forced them to be their own executioners. It was a form of justice that was far more depraved and cruel than any he had ever heard of. Elias carefully placed the 5 journals in a canvas bag he had brought with him. He had found the physical proof, the irrefutable evidence of a century-old crime. He had to get out of the town and expose this truth. He climbed back up the ladder, his mind racing. He had to leave before the town's elders, the descendants of the original founders, discovered his presence. He crept out of the chapel, the fog a welcome blanket in the cold night. He made his way back through the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached his car, started the engine, and began to drive out of the town, his tires kicking up gravel on the lonely road. He saw no one, no cars on the road, no lights in the windows. The town was a silent, sleeping organism, but Elias knew it was watching him. As he reached the town limits, he saw a solitary figure standing on the side of the road. It was Eleanor Vance, the woman from the Historical Society. She stood in the fog, her face a pale mask in the headlights. Elias slowed his car, his hand hovering over the gas pedal. Eleanor didn't say a word. She just pointed back towards the town. Her finger was not a threat, but a gesture of foreboding, a warning that he was not safe, even now. Elias didn't stop. He sped past her, leaving the silent town and its grim secrets behind. He drove for hours, the image of Eleanor's face and the chilling contents of the journals replaying in his mind. He was miles away when he realized he had left something behind, something he couldn't afford to lose. The Journal of Jedediah Abernathy, the one from the Historical Society. He had copied its contents, but the original was the key, the final piece of evidence that would tie the town directly to the crime. He had to go back. He pulled over to the side of the road, his mind a maelstrom of fear and determination. He had the outlaws' story, he had their confession, he had the physical evidence. But he needed the town's side of the story, the proof of their involvement. He had to risk it. He had to go back to Blackwood and get that journal. He turned the car around, his heart filled with a terrible certainty. He was no longer a historian. He was a man caught in a century-old conspiracy, and he had to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The truth is more terrifying than you can imagine. Join us next time to see what Elias finds and to help us reach our next subscriber goal. The decision to return to Blackwood was a grim, calculated risk. Elias knew he was walking back into a lion's den, but he couldn't leave without Jedediah Abernathy's journal. It was the only piece of evidence directly connecting the town's founding families to the psychological torment of the outlaws. He drove through the pre-dawn hours, the quiet roads of Appalachia now feeling like a labyrinth designed to trap him. He arrived back in Blackwood just as the sun began to cast a pale light over the mountains. The town was still, the few lights in the windows appearing like watchful, unblinking eyes. He drove to the Historical Society, the small building appearing more ominous than ever. The front door, which he had left unlocked in his haste, was now bolted shut. He tried the back door, and to his surprise, it was unlocked. The town wasn't stopping him. They were inviting him in. It was a new kind of terror, a knowing silence that was far more chilling than any overt threat. He stepped inside, the air still and musty. The display case where Abernathy's journal was kept was open, and the journal itself was gone. Elias felt a wave of despair wash over him. They knew. They had moved the evidence, and now he had nothing. He had the outlaws' journals, but they were the words of dead men. He needed the town's own confession. He had failed. Just as he was about to turn and leave, He heard a sound, a quiet cough from the back of the room. He turned, and there, sitting at a small cluttered desk, was an old man, his face a web of wrinkles and his eyes a piercing blue. He was the man Elias had seen whittling on the porch, the town elder. "I knew you'd come back," the old man said, his voice a dry whisper. "You're a man who needs all the pieces, aren't you?" Elias's mind raced. He had been so focused on his mission, he hadn't considered the possibility of a direct confrontation. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am the keeper of the story," the old man said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "My name is John. My family has been here for generations. We are the direct descendants of the shepherd." Elias's heart pounded. He had found the source, the head of the snake. "You knew they were coming back for the journal." John laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "We knew you would return. It's what you were meant to do. You have the outlaw's story. I have the town's. And now, you will have both." He reached into a drawer and pulled out the missing journal. He placed it on the desk in front of Elias. "Read it," he said. "Read the truth." Elias opened the journal, his hands trembling. The final pages were filled with Jedediah Abernathy's final entries, written in a clear, precise hand. He didn't write of madness or despair, but of triumph. "The work is complete. The souls are cleansed. The outlaws, with their pride and their malice, have been purified. We did not kill them. We did not shed their blood. We simply held a mirror to their souls and forced them to see the truth of who they were. They chose their own end. It was the only way they could find a true and lasting peace." The journal went on to describe the town's purification process. They had used every piece of information they could gather on the outlaws, their crimes, and their personal failings. They had created the perfect psychological trap. The weeping woman was a local resident, trained to use the chapel's acoustics to create a sound that would trigger the outlaw's guilt. The ringing bell was a small, high-pitched one, a constant irritant that would drive a man to the edge of sanity. The carefully planted objects and stolen food were designed to sow distrust. The town wasn't just observing the outlaws, they were actively tormenting them. "We are not murderers," John said, his voice quiet but firm. "We are healers. We do not believe in an eye for an eye. We believe a man must face his own darkness. The outlaws were given a choice. They chose to end their suffering. We simply provided them with the means to do so. They found a peace they could never have found in a prison cell or on the gallows." Elias felt a cold rage. This wasn't justice. It was a cold, calculated form of psychological depravity. "You drove them to suicide," Elias said, his voice shaking. "We showed them the way," John corrected him. "We saved them from a life of sin. We released them from their own demons. Their bodies are not here. We gave them a final right, a burial in a place only we know, a place where they could truly rest." Elias knew where the outlaws' bodies were, John was telling him. The place only we know was not a burial ground. It was a secret place, a place the town had made sure no one would ever find. He had to see it. He had to find the final piece of evidence. He had to find the truth, the whole truth, before this cold, calculating man could stop him. He knew he was in danger. He had the town's confession. Now, he had to see the final act of this macabre story. Elias knew the risk, but his professional integrity and a deep-seated revulsion at the town's twisted logic compelled him to see it through. He had to find the final resting place of the outlaws. John, the town elder, seemed to anticipate his every move. He stood and walked to a far corner of the room, pulling a thick velvet curtain aside. Behind it, a small, worn wooden door was revealed. "They are here," John said simply. "Their final resting place." a testament to a broken soul finding peace. Elias felt a chill. The Historical Society was not just a repository of old records, it was a memorial to the town's terrible justice. Elias approached the door, his heart pounding. The air was cold, and a faint, musty scent emanated from the small space. He hesitated. He had found the confession, he had found the story of the outlaw's mental descent. But what lay behind that door was the final, horrifying confirmation. He looked at John. The old man's face was calm, his eyes a cold, unwavering blue. He seemed to have no remorse, no guilt. He was a true believer in the town's twisted doctrine. "You did this to them," Elias said, his voice filled with a quiet fury. "You broke them. You didn't give them peace. You gave them a choice between madness and suicide. You are murderers, every last one of you." John's face remained impassive. "We gave them a choice. We showed them a way to cleanse their souls. We are not murderers. We are the keepers of a sacred trust. The world is full of people who take and never give back. The outlaws were a test. We passed it." Elias pushed the door open. The space was a small, unlit room. He used his flashlight, its beam illuminating a small, meticulously organized exhibit. There were no bodies, no skeletons. There were 5 glass cases, each one holding a single personal object belonging to one of the outlaws. In the first case was Silas's Colt, .45, its metal tarnished, the wooden grip worn smooth from years of use. In the second, Jed's worn leather holster, its loops empty of bullets. In the third, Finn's signature red bandana, now faded and stained. In the fourth, Eli's small, leather-bound book of playing card tricks. In the fifth, Abe's hand-carved slingshot, a relic of his childhood. But that was not all. In the center of the room, a large, ornate wooden cabinet was displayed. John walked over to it and unlocked it, revealing a series of small glass jars. Each jar contained a single object, each one a piece of the outlaw's final confession. One jar held a small, rusted piece of a razor blade, a testament to a man who had chosen to end his suffering. Another held a few neatly folded pieces of rope, a sign of a final choice. And in a final jar, a single, empty syringe, a last act of a broken man. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The town had not just tormented them. They had collected the evidence of their self-destruction, a macabre trophy room of their twisted justice. They had cleansed the outlaws of their worldly sins, and then, in a final act of cruelty, they had preserved the very tools of their demise. "They did this themselves," John said, his voice filled with a chilling pride. "We did not kill them. We simply helped them find their way." Elias had found the truth. The outlaws had not vanished. They had been systematically broken and driven to suicide by a community that believed it was doing the work of God. The bootprints ending at the chapel were a grim testament to the outlaws' final steps towards their own end. Elias had found the outlaws' journals and the town's own confession. He had found the truth, and now he knew he had to get out of Blackwood and expose this terrible secret to the world. He looked at John. The old man, a descendant of the very people who had committed this act, stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the remnants of his ancestors' terrible justice. Elias knew he had to act. He had to get out of the town and share the story. He had the proof. He had the truth. And he knew that the town would not let him leave quietly. He had to make a choice. He could leave the story buried, or he could risk his life to expose the truth. Elias knew he had to get out. The town's museum of psychological horrors was a testament to a crime far more sinister than murder. He had the outlaws' journals, the town elder's confession, and the horrifying display of their final acts. He turned to John, his mind already racing with a plan. "I understand," Elias said, his voice calm, a carefully constructed facade. "I see now. It was not murder, it was a form of purification. John's face softened slightly, a hint of a pleased smile on his lips. "You are a man of reason. You understand the difference. The outlaws were not victims. They were souls who had lost their way, and we simply showed them the path back to themselves." Elias feigned a gesture of respect, his hand reaching for the old man's. "I thank you for showing me this. I will leave this story where it is. It is not for the world to know." John shook his head. "No, you won't. You will tell the world, but you will tell it our way. You will write a book, and it will be a testament to a town that found a new form of justice, a more perfect form." Elias's heart sank. John was not going to let him leave with the truth. He was going to manipulate the narrative just as his ancestors had manipulated the outlaws. He was a true believer, and he was not going to let a historian from the outside world tarnish his family's legacy. "I can do that," Elias said, his voice steady. He knew he had one chance. He had to find a way to get out of the town, to escape the town's network of spies. He had to make a break for it. Elias walked slowly to the door, his eyes scanning the room, looking for an escape route. He saw a window to the left, small and high up, but it was a chance. He had to get out before John and the town's elders could stop him. He began to talk, to distract John, his mind working quickly. He spoke of the journals, of the outlaws' final confessions. He asked questions about the process, about the town's founding. John, caught up in the story of his own triumph, began to speak, his voice filled with a chilling, self-righteous pride. The outlaws' final choice was a testament to their true character, John said. They had finally accepted their sins, and they were willing to pay the ultimate price to be free of them. We saved them. We saved their souls. As John spoke, Elias moved silently towards the window. He was a historian, not a fighter, but he had to try. He reached the window, and with a quick, decisive motion he broke the glass, the sound shattering the silence of the museum. John's head snapped towards him, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrible realization. Elias pushed himself through the window, his body scraping against the broken glass. He fell to the ground, his body bruised and bleeding. He had to get to his car. He had to get out. He ran through the quiet, sleeping streets of Blackwood, the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. He looked back and saw John standing at the window, a look of cold, calculating fury on his face. He knew he had to get away. He reached his car, started the engine, and sped out of town, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. He didn't look back. He drove for hours, until the sun was high in the sky, and the mountains of Appalachia were a distant memory in his rearview mirror. He had escaped. He had the outlaws' journals. He had the truth, and he was alive. He stopped at a small gas station miles from Blackwood, and filled up his car. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking, his body aching from the escape. He had the story. He had the truth. He had to write it. He had to tell the world about the vanishing outlaws of Appalachia, not as a ghost story, but as a chilling, real-life tale of psychological terror, of a town that had found a new, more terrible form of justice. The truth of the outlaws' demise was not a mystery, it was a horror story. And now Elias, the historian, was the only one alive to tell it. He had found the macabre end, and now he had to make sure the world knew what happened to the 5 outlaws who had vanished into the mountains and who had never truly left. He had found their peace, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. The story was over, but the chilling memory of Blackwood and its terrible justice would stay with him forever.